The Day Lady Died by Frank O'Hara. It is 12:20 in New York, a Friday. 3 days after Bastille Day, yes, it is 1959, and I will go get a shoe shine because I will get off the 419 in East Hampton at 7:15 and then go straight to dinner. And I don't know the people who will feed me. I walk up the muggy street beginning to sun, and I will have a hamburger and a malted and buy an ugly New World writing to see what the poets in Ghana are doing these days. I go onto the bank, and Miss Stillwagon, first name Linda, I once heard, doesn't even look at my balance for once in her life. And in the Golden Griffin, I get a little Verlaine for Patsy with drawings by Bernard, although I do think of Hesiod translated by Richmond Lattimore, or Brendan Behan's new play, Les Balcons, or Les Négresses of Gannett, but I don't. I stick with Verlaine after practically going to sleep with Quandrinus. And for Mike, I just stroll to the Park Lane liquor store and ask for a bottle of Strega and go back to where I came from to 6th Avenue and the tobacconist in the Ziegfeld Theater and casually ask for a carton of Gauloises and a carton of Picayunes and a New York Post with her face on it. I'm sweating a lot by now, and I'm thinking of leaning on the John door in the 5 spot as she whispered a song along the keyboard to Mal Waldron, and everyone and I stopped breathing. This is a free verse poem written by Frank O'Hara, and it comes from his collection of poems called Lunch Poems. Most people who read this poem now wouldn't know what it's about because there's little to no reference of who this lady that died is. But if you do some research into the poem, you'll know that this poem was written by a woman named Billie Holiday, who was a famous jazz musician. Somebody who's reading this poem at the time who would know who Billie Holiday is would pick up a few hints. For example, it says the day Lady died, and Billie Holiday was known for her alias as Lady Day. This was written 3 days after Bastille Day, which is July 14th, and Bastille Day is July 14th, but Billie Holiday died on July 17th, which is 3 days after Bastille Day. Yes, it is 1959. So everything I've underlined in green is a direct hint at who we're talking about, and everything I've highlighted in blue or underlined in blue is just a reference to who we're talking about. She whispered, her face on it, and Lady, which is referencing Lady Day or Billie Holiday. The reason I'm talking about this poem is because I want my students to understand the significance of historical context. If you're going to read a book or a poem or any piece of writing for any reason, it's important to determine when it's written and when it takes place. And thankfully, this poem was written the day it takes place. So in order to understand what's going on here, you would have to know who Billie Holiday is and who she was and how she died to really grasp and empathize with O'Hara's pain in this poem. Billie Holiday had a really difficult life, especially towards the end of it. She struggled with a substance abuse towards the end of her life, which wouldn't have been as much of a problem legally if it weren't for the fact that she wrote this poem named Strange Fruit, in which she discussed these racist killings that occurred in the South that she had personally witnessed. And she was attacked by the FBI or asked to stop singing these songs in public. They asked her to not release it as an album, and she refused. She kept singing this song in public, which resulted in the FBI launching a sting operation against her to catch her in the act of using cocaine and heroin, which she was using. And she asked to be put in a hospital, and she was put in a hospital to kick the drugs, and they had her on methadone for a little while, but abruptly took her off of it, which resulted in her dying in a hospital bed, which she was unfortunately handcuffed to. And before this, she was a very famous jazz musician, and at one point, we see a time shift between this paragraph and this paragraph. He's discussing what happens up until New York Post with her face on it. Frank O'Hara found out about Billie Holiday's death through the New York Post, and her face was on the cover of it, which illustrates just how famous Billie Holiday was, and how anyone reading the poem when it was written in 1959 would immediately know who O'Hara is talking about. Like I said, 3 days after Bastille Day, yes, it is 1959. He's guessing that the reader is thinking, is it that 3 days after Bastille Day? Are we talking about Billie Holiday? Yes, it is 1959, as if to say, yes, I'm talking about that day. After that, he says, I'm in the Golden Griffin, I'm by Park Lane Liquor Store, I'm on 6th Avenue. He's getting closer to the 5 spot, and then he says, boom, I'm at the 5 spot. Song along the keyboard to Mal Waldron. Mal Waldron was Billie Holiday's accompanist up until the end of her career, where she was arrested. Everyone and I stopped breathing. She was an amazing musician, and everybody would be completely silent when she would perform. She had a lot of fans. And the point of this is that if you didn't know who Billie Holiday was, or you've never heard of her, at a first glance, this poem would make no sense. Besides the title, you would never guess that this was about somebody dying. It just seems like these are his daily events, which is something that Frank O'Hara was known for doing. He would write poems about daily life. He was a very relatable artist. He was strikingly honest and somewhat vulgar in most of his poems. This is the only poem that anyone was allowed to perform at Poetry Out Loud for the high school performances, because every other poem he's ever written was extremely vulgar, contained a lot of curse words, sexual content, everything like that. So Frank O'Hara was a very relatable poet, and everybody could kind of feel the grief he was going through when he released this. And it doesn't explicitly say, I was so sad, this and that. He's just sort of bringing in his audience and saying, I had such a casual day, I did the usual things. I went to dinner, I don't know the people who will feed me, I bought this for that one, I bought this for Mike, I went to the Park Lane liquor store, all of his casual day-to-day experiences. And the moment where he realizes that Billie Holiday has died is so casually placed in there. And a carton of Picayunes and a New York Post with her face on it. This is referencing Billie Holiday and the way he found out she died. So here we see a time shift, and this is the last time you saw Billie Holiday perform. I'm sweating a lot by now, and I'm thinking of leaning on the John Doerr in the 5 spot as she whispered a song along the keyboard to Mal Waldron, and everyone and I stopped breathing. The 5 spot was one of the few places she was still allowed to perform because so many people would not take her because of her controversy. She was known for sometimes collapsing during performances because of the drugs that she was using. And there was a lot of controversy, of course, around her song Strange Fruit. So it was not always safe for a venue to accept her. But the 5 spot was one of the few places she was still allowed to perform, and this was in Bowery, New York, where O'Hara lived at the time. So anyone who knows where O'Hara lived, was a big fan of O'Hara, would know what this is about. Anyone who is very knowledgeable on who Billie Holiday is might know exactly the day she died, would know what this is. But for the most part, if you are a reader who doesn't live in 1959, it's very important to figure out exactly what's going on here, not just look up, well, what is this poem about? Who is he referring to? But just to think about what happened in 1959. Who is Frank O'Hara? Where did Frank O'Hara live? Who is Lady Day? And who's Billie Holiday, and what is she known for? And when you get these pieces of the puzzle that seem like they should be outside of this, it all kind of comes together. A poem never sits on its own. It's a part of history. And when you say, for example, Critical and Literary Terms by Bennett and Royal briefly discusses how a poem or a piece of writing doesn't sit on its own. It's a part of history. It's a historical paper. It's historical context, and it's just as valid as a script writer or one of those people that throughout history who would sit and write about history and wrote, this happened. Like, it's like a textbook. A poem like this is just as valid as a textbook to help, say, for example, a historian or just somebody who's interested in the culture of whatever happened in 1959 to look at and determine what exactly was going on or how people were feeling about the events of the time. It's not its own thing. It's buried within history, and it helps so much to understand everything around it, to get all of the context for what's in it. You can't possibly understand the poem without understanding what was going on in 1959, who's Billie Holiday, who's Frank O'Hara. So as you can see, there's a lot of significance to the historical context around a piece of art, because the first time I read this poem, I had absolutely no idea what it was about. I just thought it sounded nice, but then I did all this research into Billie Holiday and Frank O'Hara, and I was able to enjoy the poem so much more. And that's what makes a poem great, is that it's enjoyable, it's engaging. You can empathize with what a poet or an author or whatever they're feeling. And you get so much more out of it when you know exactly what they're talking about and how they're feeling, because I thought this poem was boring and disengaging, and it seemed like a meaningless list of his daily events. But it's a way of saying, look how casual everything is. New York Post with her face on it, I find out that this incredible jazz musician who I had a lot of love for died. And this touched him so much that he actually sat down and wrote this poem the day that she passed away. So when you're able to empathize with a poet or an author and really feel what they're going through, you're able to get a lot more out of their work. And that's why historical context is so important.